August and I started saying some time ago, good noon. It's, oh boy, it's falling down. Yeah, it's about 1:17. We decided the space between like 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. is really its own kind of pocket. And we, instead of saying good morning or good afternoon, we say good noon. So, I'm going to try something a little bit new. Well, mostly for me. I suppose it'll be new for you too, though, because I do things in my own way. And I'm sure that you take them in your own way. It's kind of part of the fun of reality. So, what I'm feeling is a lot of this beautiful Cancery energy. Yesterday, we had the new moon in Cancer at its peak, so we're still a little in that new moon in Cancer. We've got the sun in Cancer, the moon in Cancer. It's a very nice place to be in terms of exploring home. Cancer rules the fourth house, which is ruled by the moon. So when the moon is in Cancer, it is exalted. It is got that extra, I don't want to say oomph because it's Cancer, so it's that extra mmm, like that feeling. Though Cancer also, the fourth house, I like to think of it as the kitchen if it's in a house. It's often where you're going to find mama. You're going to find mother preparing things, thinking about people, adding that secret ingredient of love to every dish that she cooks. Or likewise, if your mom did not do those things or was not there in that space or that space became hostile, that's when you're going to see those things start to come up more, is when you've got alignments with Cancer and the moon. Now, this particular time feels like, I mean, it's funny. Normally, actually, I'm just thinking of this. Normally, it's the full moon that we do releasings of. And I know that the energy that just came to me, I wrote some thoughts down for this because it didn't feel like it was going to be like a channeling thing, is that it's definitely about releasing. Though the message coming through right now is this is helping to prepare for the next full moon. These things that you put some focus onto, they will begin to be released fully. Like they'll begin to release now, but they'll really fully begin to be released by the next full moon. And I believe the next full moon, let's see, will be sun. It will probably still be will be sun in Leo, and so it should be full moon in Aquarius, which is a really good sign for this kind of releasing because it feels like collective movement. It kind of feels like even watching this video will give you a little extra to your oomph to your releasing because everybody's working on this stuff whether they know it or not. Also, it feels important to say that because this is a new moon and because we're not limited, we can plant and seed and release at the same time. So it's important as I talk about what I'm going to talk about, you want to think about what aspects of that you want to release, and then think about what you want to plant in its place. Especially because what this mama cancery new moon energy is bringing to me is a lot. It's for a lot of people, it's a lot of big stuff. And it's not that you can't go on without any of it, but it's been such a part of your life that it might take a minute before you can have less in its place, before you can be lighter from it. You'll already be a little bit lighter just from listening, watching, taking in things telepathically, whichever way you prefer to watch your videos. So the main energy that's coming to me that's saying, release me, do the shadow work, alchemize me into light, is the energy that has to do with wounds of neglect, which are connected to, like, if you feel triggered by anybody not talking to you or releasing your connection with them, whatever it is, or not, like, if you've been like, say, in a twin flame dynamic, and you feel like you've been struggling with feelings of not being chosen, or having no communication blocks, things like that. That stuff can all be based on wounds of neglect. And when you go back and you think about it, and you look at your childhood, you can probably see it there. And even if you can't see it, you could probably delicately ask about it, you know? For a while, there was a number of generations that were taught that, like, full on cry it out method was the best way to get a baby to sleep through the night. And I know through my own experience that some amount of getting your infant used to you not coming every time that they cry is, yes, that is productive. But just leaving a child to cry and cry and cry, that can create wounds of neglect in our earliest moments. Because when we are infants and up till at least like 4 or 5-ish. It can take longer than that, but like earliest there, we don't have the mechanisms in our brain to understand that when another being in our vibration, in our vision, is no longer in front of us where we can see them, that they have not ceased to exist. And so, and that's based on survival mechanisms, and people thought they were doing the right thing. So, like, yes, is it unfair? Yes. But was it done with the intention to hurt a bunch of kids or create a bunch of people with, like, unhealed neglect wounds? No. No, it wasn't. And then there are other things, like like, go back through your past, start as early as you can, and work forward and look at where you may have wounds of neglect. Some of them could be things like if you were ignored a lot in your childhood, like you may have been an only child, or you may have been the youngest child or the oldest child, or whatever way it is. And don't don't sit and qualify like, well, other people had it worse. Right now is not the time for that. Just stop and say, did I feel really ignored, really unseen when I was growing up? And yeah, you can look at some of the whys, but really it's just that acknowledgement. Did you feel that way? Whether it's right or wrong, whether there's more to it or not, did you feel that way? If you felt that way, it matters. And it's not a place you're going to go to stay, but you probably got some shadow work to do on that, especially if you're finding you still have blocks from the things that you really want, the things that you really love, the people that you really love. And I'll say some stuff a little bit later that can help you with some of those blocks and unblocking them too. Something else could be if you had siblings or parents or a lot of kids at schools that did like silent treatment games, or like that invisible game where I can't see who's saying that thing. I can't hear them. We're gonna go play somewhere else. Like games like that can create wounds of neglect. Um, not if you had parents that were in like a codependent cycle, whether they were, I mean, there's so many new things about it, but let's say one of them, had a lot of healing to do, and they had deep addictions, and the other parent was very codependent with them, and you grew up basically watching them play the runner chaser thing, right? It's usually the dad has the addictive problem, and the mom's addiction is the dad. And you end up being like, even if one of your or both of your parents was like hyper vigilant with you or ultra strict with you, you can still get wounds of neglect, because oftentimes the only thing they're managing about you is your reflection to the partner, or whether or not you're doing anything that might trigger their partner, and you get neglected in that, you as in who you are, your character building, you feeling protected. And even in that, there's a lot of times that it's not like directly that your parents did stuff to you. It could be that while your parents were in their codependent cycle, they may have placed you in a daycare or in a school or let you go do things where you got hurt or left you with family where you got hurt. And they probably knew, at least instinctively, that something was wrong, but they put their focus repeatedly into the other parent. And, and then there's parents who you've told them, I got hurt, I'm being hurt, I don't like this, is there? And they might say, no, that's not true, or you're just jealous, or that person would never do that, or, well, you know what, you shouldn't have done that thing that made them upset, or you shouldn't have worn the clothes that made them think they had the option, or, a lot of the things that society is overall healing. And, those can create wounds of neglect. Oof, I'm feeling that big heart chakra stuff. And then I called it having your squishes squashed. So having your sensitivities, um, your emotions squashed, told, like well, I want to say for men, but it happens for women too, and happens even more if you're outside the gender binary. But when you have an emotional response to something, especially something that is either unfair to you or perceived to be unfair to you, or just not like it doesn't bring you joy and gratitude, then adults would often tell you you got to behave and you got to hush up and you got to do this because it makes adults' lives easier, or because we said so, or we're the boss, or this and that, or if you cry, you're a sissy, or you get told, yeah, girls are always crying, like when your sensitivities are made to be wrong, or if you get told that you're crazy or bipolar or weird or insane because you have more emotions than other people, or because you get more excited than other people, or whatever the thing is, when your squishes get squashed, that ends up becoming a wound of neglect because it's a side of you that then you are taught to hold back and to not share with anybody because it's painful when you do. It becomes painful to share that with people, to be seen in that way, and then basically be shown and told that nobody wants to see that you will be perceived as weak and able to be, that you're vulnerable and that people will either take advantage of you or that nobody will love you if you have sensitivities. That can create wounds of neglect where you end up neglecting yourself first. You get trained into the self neglect of it. You didn't get it from the important places, the most important places growing up, and then other people didn't get it, and then you co manifest that together, that we don't share our real selves. We don't do that. And anytime you get hurt more and more after that, you pile on to the wounds of neglect, because just in that own thing of teaching you that you can't be sensitive, that you can't be authentic, that you'll always be either abused or rejected for doing it, then you end up compartmentalizing, which is like trying to sweep things under the rug. But then all you do is you have a rug that's got a bunch of stuff under it that's still there. And you just start putting more stuff on it. Other parts can be when your parents or adults in charge allow your boundaries to be violated by either their other adult guests or their adult guests' children, or family members, things like that. Like if you go to a park and you bring your kids, or you were brought there, um, and there were other kids there that were being bullies, usually your parents would redirect you away from them, right? There's no attachment to them socially, and that's a clear, like, let's move away from them. At least most parents would. Some didn't. If your parents did not, hence wounds of neglect in there. But more often what it is like you could have a cousin or something like that picked on you, bullied you, touched you in inappropriate ways, but it was made to be acceptable by adults because they didn't want to create drama in the family, or it could be maybe you had an aunt who had a child that was like constantly screaming and throwing and kicking things and biting and doing all that stuff. And, all the kids were, they'd say, oh, everybody out in the backyard, and nobody be watching the kids. So you're that kid whose boundaries are then being violated. And you can try to go to the adults, but if there's not an actual effective loving response that helps resolve it, and you're continually put in that position, even if when the guests leave or you go home, things are comfortable with your parents and your siblings and stuff, and they don't typically do that very much, that can create wounds of neglect because you were not protected in those moments. And usually the kids doing it were not protected in those moments either, and weren't protected in other moments, which is how they built said habits. And then that builds up. But because nobody, came up screaming, and it resulted in pleasant situations between the adults, nobody stops and goes, hey, wait a minute, maybe that shouldn't be happening. Or maybe we should redirect this. Like, it should almost happen more so the more closely you are connected to somebody, especially, like, say, family wise, you know, just as you would at a park. But if you had people that did that with you growing up, if you were left in situations with other kids or family members or friends that bullied or were passive aggressive or left you out or didn't protect you, didn't help, I'm not talking about like people always needing to hover over everybody, but somebody who's in general in charge and making sure that everybody feels good and that nobody's feeling like they're not getting what they need or being treated unfairly. And if you didn't get that, that can create wounds of neglect. I'm feeling big shoulder weight. I don't know if that's somebody that will feel it or just from me, but I can work on starting to release that. And then, being accused of or punished for things that you didn't actually do, which unfortunately has also happened to a lot of us. And that can feel like neglecting, like when your parent or parental figure, or the adult around, does not believe you, especially when you've either been honest or you have like consistently told the truth, and you don't get believed in those moments and you get punished on top of that. That then teaches you either that it's better to lie and get away from it, or that it is that genuineness and justice will be punished the same as if you weren't being just, and that then you hold back on that. You don't want to speak up for others, and you don't want to speak up for yourself. It feels like it'll end up being the same result, and then either you end up punished for what you didn't do, or somebody else ends up punished worse than they really should have been. They should never be punished. They were not taught the discipline to correct behavior. Instead, they get punished. So it's either you get punished or they get punished. And no kid wants to make that choice, And same adults. As adults, we don't want to make that choice either. We will, but we don't want to make that choice. Then, being told that your creations are valueless. Like, say you grew up and you like to write poems, and you had a dream of being a famous poet, a poet laureate, and you had at least one significant person, but probably many, who said, "Yeah, that's nice, and those are beautiful, but they won't pay the bills." Or, outright, stop doing your art, stop playing your music, stop doing those creative things. You got to worry about learning to grow up. You got to worry about getting a real job. Your art will never be a real job. Your music will never be a real job. So put those childish things away while you're still a child and focus on other things. Like, that can create wounds of neglect also. And then being conditioned into conformity, which is a lot of times where we get conditioned into codependence, to where individuality is squashed, and you probably had a lot of obligations laid on you that were not appropriate, whether it was needed or not needed. Remember what I said in the beginning, it depends on how you feel you were treated in it. But when you're told that your needs are less important than the needs of the collective over and over and over again, and nobody stops to show you when it is appropriate to have your own needs, that can create wounds of neglect and teach you to neglect yourself. Then, if you were often forgotten about, either by family or friends or anything like that, step parents, stuff like that, um, if your birthdays were forgotten, if your special days were forgotten, if you were, just left around and felt like you felt forgotten. And then being excluded from things for stuff that you cannot control. I know it may sound silly, but something like if you didn't have a super like strong body growing up, you may have been excluded because you seemed weak, or if you were overweight, you may have been excluded because you were overweight, or you may have been excluded because you were very emotional. You may have been excluded because you're the oldest and you have to be responsible, or the youngest and because you don't have the greatest emotional response, or if you had a disability or something like that, you get excluded for things you can't control. Or um, one that feels relevant for me is like ADHD stuff. Like, if I change my mind on stuff too much, then I seem inconsistent. If I want to start something and then quit something, it's seen as inappropriate because that's not how neurotypical does it. It's not something I can entirely control. I've developed a lot of um, compensatory methods to be able to do a lot of the same things that a neurotypical will do, but it can create wounds of neglect when you can't control what you're doing, and you then get excluded from or blocked from things for stuff that you at the time could not control. And if you had more criticism and correction or bigger focus on discipline and or punishment and little to no positive feedback, that can create wounds of neglect too, because a lot of times adults would get busy and they're more worried about don't create trouble for me, be doing, stay in line at school and do this and that, and also about not being seen as a parent who's not doing good enough with their children. So then it's constant correction, 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 or criticism or frustration because you're not getting it right. 22 on the clock. And then how often did you get positive feedback about, like, you did really good on that, I'm really proud you did that, you know what, that didn't get done all the way, but I'm really impressed with the part that you did, things like that. If you didn't get a lot of that, it can create wounds of neglect. And then other, like, working forward, like if you were not picked first a lot, like occasionally is one thing, but if you're not picked first a lot when you were in school or in social settings, that can create wounds of neglect. As can, as you get older, having friends, or if you have friends that typically only reach out to you last, or don't think of you very often, or um, you don't get invited to the big parties, or then later you have relationships with somebody who leaves you for somebody else, or cheats on you, or isn't like forthcoming with at least consistent affection. Doesn't necessarily have to be like over the top stuff, but just reciprocating things, that can then exasperate, I think I said that right, the wounds of neglect, and can add to it. Now, yeah, so a lot of these things show up when we end up in situations where we care the most about somebody, and where we see that somebody cares the most about us. And these wounds of neglect, especially the more that you've experienced in shorter periods of time or for prolonged periods of time, they end up creating this manifestation where the closer you get to somebody else, the more you start to see the potential for them to hurt you. And a lot of times when you start, and when you don't see that you're doing that, all you see is that it was good and now it's bad, which really doesn't make a whole ton of sense if you think about it, but it's there. Um, but that it then ends up becoming that the people that you want to be close to, that you see that are giving you the most affection and stuff, that they seem like the most dangerous. And you usually, until you start to look at the wounds that create that sort of stuff, it can be very challenging to recognize the difference between somebody who is like, yeah, they might be a manifestation of situations you grew up going through that created those wounds, that most people aren't. Most people are not going to do that. And there are going to be times when you get hurt, but you got to get through that shadow work and get in there. And part of the shadow work is turning it to light so that you're not just, see, turn it to light, right? So that you're not just looking at the ick. I think that's part of why I've held back from doing videos like this a bit, because you can get really triggered by looking at this stuff, and it might take you down a rabbit hole for a minute. But either way, once you recognize that you can put something in its place that feels more joyful and brings more gratitude to you, then you can start to see the benefits of the practice of that. And that's why it's important to stop when you think about any of these things and look for the gratitude in it. Not because, get away from things like, was it fair or was it right or wrong or things like that. And just get to where you're asking yourself, what makes me feel more satisfied? What makes me feel more whole? You know, being hurt by somebody that was broken, which means that that's a part of my identity, because if they were broken, then I must be broken too. I must be born of brokenness. Or that you had people who loved you who were doing the best that they could with what they knew how, you know, and that they were not broken, that they grew as much as they did for you, just as you grow as much as you are for those whose lives you touch, whether they're your children or anybody else. And then think about, once you're freed up a lot of the weight of wounds like these, you can feel it lift from your heart, you can feel it lift from your shoulders, you can feel it lift from your mind. What will you do with that freedom? Like, imagine that you're no longer bothered by either the pressure to communicate or to be communicated with. Imagine that you're no longer concerned when there are, moments where it's just you. Imagine that you're not bothered by being seen or unseen. That you're good being on a stage in front of everybody, and you feel good about it even if it's not perfect. In fact, it's usually better if it's not perfect. But let's just say for fun that you're okay with that. That you feel like you could walk through any crowd and be any sort of person in it, and that you're also okay with not being seen at all, with being in a space where it's not even that people forget about you necessarily, or, like, see, a lot of this message is new. Explore the spaces between being seen and being unseen in positive ways. Look for the light that is in there, because it's within those spaces. That's what you can do. For as many ways as you feel like you were neglected and not believed and not encouraged to grow in healthy, positive ways, go in and look for the ways that you were. I guarantee that they're there. No human is all light or all dark. There are ways that are there. In some way, Spirit provided to you somebody who said something good to you. Think about those moments. Think about moments that you've been recognized when you didn't expect to be, in pleasantly surprising ways. Think about ways that you were picked first, are picked first. Look at how many times you picked yourself first, right? And think about all the good that you have in there, and then build from there. Sometimes shadow work is simply an acknowledgement that you felt a certain way through a certain experience, and acknowledging it as the way that you experienced it then. And just in that acknowledgement, and then stopping and countering it with something positive that happened to you, that, especially the stuff that wasn't expected, you can release it bit by bit there, you know? But this lovely Cancer energy is coming in to help with that. So, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to go in and look at your wounds of neglect. And not just look at them, the bigger thing to do is to look at how you're reflecting, how you're still reflecting things that may have been done to you before. And especially if you have any blocks with any particular person or with your career or with anything, you can almost guarantee that if you start looking at what are you neglecting, what are you neglecting when you feel like you're not getting A, B, or C, or that person or that thing? What are you neglecting? It could be your garden in the backyard. It could be picking up a mess that, doesn't hurt anybody if it stays there. It could be making a new appointment for something that you missed doing a while ago. It could be reaching out to friendships that you've not connected with in a while. That can get the movement going. Look at what you are neglecting. I'm sure there's something. Nobody's perfect. And if you're feeling neglected or you felt neglected, usually there's something that you can. It's not that it's up to you to fix it. It's not about fixing it. Do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? Do you want to always be righteous or do you want to feel grateful? And I can tell you what, the magic of the I heal, you heal kind of thing is so much more worth it than sitting around being mad because people aren't reacting the way that I want them to. It's much more fun to get up and clean up my cigarette butts and clean up the messes that I've been setting to the wayside because I've been in my fields and my squishes and stuff, and to watch that change things with my DM, with my family, with my friends, with my business. It frees up a whole lot of things. And if you'd like any assistance with this in this moment, feel free to email me at wickedlydivinefeminine@gmail.com or call my Google Voice line at 206-486-GOAL, GOAL. I'm going to leave this here because my phone's still on low battery life from that big channeling I did earlier, so I will see you in the next video.